The reservoir looked dead at first glance. That was Officer Ethan Cole's first thought as he eased his county SUV onto the final stretch of access road and let the tires crunch over frozen gravel. To his left, the water spread wide and colorless beneath a winter sky, a sheet of dull steel broken only by wind scars and the jagged black ribs of drowned tree stumps rising near the shore. To his right stood pines bent by years of hard weather, their dark branches trembling under gusts that came down the slope like a warning. Nothing about the place invited comfort. Nothing about it looked alive. And yet the dog in the back of the SUV had been restless for the last quarter mile. Ethan glanced in the rearview mirror. K9 Shadow stood braced in the cargo area, tall and still despite the motion of the vehicle. The German shepherd's ears were forward, not loose. His body had gone quiet in that way Ethan knew too well. Not relaxed, not anxious, but engaged. Tracking, processing, deciding. Shadow's eyes were fixed not on the road ahead, but past Ethan's shoulder toward the shoreline, where an old structure leaned against the wind. The pump house. It sat half-hidden among winter brush and dead reeds, a square concrete building with a rusted door and two narrow windows filmed over with grime. A corroded pipe jutted from the side wall and disappeared underground toward the reservoir embankment. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. Snow had gathered in the cracks like old bone dust. Ethan exhaled through his nose. He had reviewed the county file twice before making the drive. The site in question was a decommissioned K9 training outpost, kennels, a classroom building, storage shed, fenced drill yard, 2 utility structures, a narrow service dock, and a disused pump house tied to an older flood control system, no longer central to operations. The county had closed the outpost 8 years ago, then left it to weather and budget neglect. Now a private buyer was moving fast to acquire the land, allegedly for regional redevelopment tied to reservoir recreation upgrades. That alone had been enough to irritate Captain Maria Hayes. Fast land deals around public infrastructure always did. Still, Ethan had not expected anything more complicated than verifying the property condition, logging salvageable equipment, and confirming whether the county could legally release the site before the end of the quarter. Busy work, mostly. A temporary assignment for an officer whose career had narrowed over the last year into the kind of duties departments handed to capable people they no longer entirely trusted with the wrong kind of risk. He knew what people said, not out loud, not directly, but he knew. Good instincts, strong handler, calm in the field, reliable until the Port Mason operation. After that, the praise changed shape. It became careful, conditional, spoken like glass being set down. Ethan parked near the main gate and killed the engine. For a moment he sat without moving, gloved hands still on the wheel, eyes on the outpost. Wind dragged across the SUV in a long, low sigh. Beyond the chain-link fence, the kennel building crouched in gray silence. The training yard was half swallowed by weeds and winter grass. A faded sign hung crooked at the entrance, its lettering almost erased by weather. County K9 Auxiliary Training Site below it, barely visible beneath the rust stains. Authorized personnel only, yeah, Ethan murmured to himself. Looks real authorized now. Shadow gave a sharp, impatient whine in the back. Ethan reached over, opened the rear hatch, and stepped out into air so cold it cut the inside of his nose. Shadow jumped down lightly, landed, and immediately turned, not toward the gate, not toward the kennels, but toward the pump house by the water. He stood there, weight slightly forward, eyes fixed. Ethan watched him. Not even pretending to be subtle today, huh? Shadow did not look back. That told Ethan enough. He shut the hatch, rolled his shoulders once, and took in the rest of the sight. The sky pressed low, thick with the kind of gray that flattened distance and made sound travel strangely. The fence along the road was intact in places, folded inward in others. One security camera hung loose from its mounting arm, its lens angled toward the dirt. Another had been removed entirely, leaving only a nest of exposed wire. The county said no one had been here in months. Maybe, or maybe no one had been here who was supposed to be. Ethan popped the trunk compartment, took out a clipboard, camera, flashlight, and bolt cutters for the outer chain if the lock had seized. By the time he turned back, Shadow had already moved 6 paces toward the fence and was waiting with the controlled stillness that always made Ethan think of coiled wire. "You know the rule," Ethan said. Shadow flicked one ear. We clear what's in front of us first." The dog finally looked at him then. No defiance, no impatience, just that deep, unreadable canine focus that made Ethan feel, not for the first time, that Shadow understood more than he should. Ethan unlocked the gate and pushed through. The outpost met him with silence so complete it had texture. His boots crunched over old grit and frozen mud as he moved past the office shed first, then the training yard. Shadow stayed close on his left until Ethan finished his first slow visual sweep. Windows boarded from the inside, door to the classroom structure still chained, generator pad empty, storage shed latch broken but old. No immediate fresh footprints visible where the wind hadn't scoured the ground clean. Then they reached the kennel building. It was the largest structure on the property after the main utility house, long and low, with a corrugated roof and a concrete threshold darkened by years of rain runoff. The exterior was stained black near the drain channels. One of the kennel doors hung open inside the entry hall, rocking faintly each time the wind pressed through the building. Shadow stopped. His posture changed. The dog's head lowered slightly, not submissive, not uncertain, working. He inhaled once, twice, then moved through the doorway without waiting for command. Shadow. The name was quiet but firm. The shepherd halted instantly, muscles still gathered. Ethan came up beside him and swept his flashlight through the interior. Row after row of old kennel runs stood empty behind mesh panels silvered with dust. Stainless bowls lay stacked in one corner. A hose reel hung dead on the wall. Somewhere deeper inside, water dripped in a slow, irregular rhythm, like a clock that had forgotten how to keep time. No movement, no voices, no obvious threat. "Search," Ethan said softly. Shadow moved. He did not dart around wildly the way pets did in new places. He flowed. Past the first run, nose-cutting left, then right, down the center aisle. Pause, turn, backtrack, check the side drain, move again. Ethan followed, his own eyes scanning higher. Roofline, rafters, vent gaps, secondary exits, broken locks, recent tool marks. This had once been a professional place. You could still feel it under the dust. Discipline lived in spaces like this long after people left them. The habit of order clung to the geometry. Then Shadow stopped hard beside the third kennel bay from the rear. He stood over a patch of cracked concrete floor, no different at first glance from the rest. Tail level, ears forward, head turned down. He looked back once at Ethan, then he pawed the floor. One scrape, controlled, then another. Ethan came closer. "Show me." Shadow pawed again, then stepped aside half a pace without taking his eyes off the spot. Ethan crouched. The floor was stained, old and rough. But there, at the edge of the largest crack, something interrupted the concrete's natural line. A seam, not wide, not recent, just wrong enough to matter. He set the flashlight on the floor and ran gloved fingers through grime. Cold dust clung to the leather. The seam formed a rectangle, maybe 2 feet by 1 foot, buried so cleanly into the slab that it would have disappeared to anyone not looking for it, or anyone without a dog who knew when to insist. "Well," Ethan said quietly, "that's interesting." Shadow huffed once. Ethan used the blade of his folding knife first, then the flathead from his field tool kit. After 30 seconds of careful prying, metal clicked softly beneath the concrete lip. A recessed pull ring packed with hardened dirt. He cleared it, set his weight, and lifted. The panel came up with a dry suction sound. Underneath sat a narrow steel box wrapped in oilcloth. The air in the kennel seemed to change. Ethan felt it in the back of his neck, that instinctive tightening that belonged to locked rooms, closed cargo holds, and every bad moment in a career built on entering places that held more than they first offered. He looked at Shadow. The dog was still, alert but not alarmed. "Good find." He lifted the box out and set it on an overturned bucket nearby. The steel was cold enough to bite through his gloves. No label, no department tag. Just a small combination lock already snapped off long ago, as if whoever hit it wanted access for the right person and inconvenience for everyone else. Inside were 6 items. A weatherproof notebook bound in black synthetic material. A smaller paper logbook, sealed in plastic. A flash drive inside a pill bottle. 3 photographs clipped together, and a tarnished evidence tag with no evidence bag attached. Ethan opened the notebook first. The handwriting was blocky, compact, disciplined. Not neat for beauty, neat for function. A field hand, a cop's hand. The entries were dated across a span of 14 months, ending 11 years earlier. Most were short and coded with initials, locations, and timestamps. But scattered between them were lines written plainly enough to punch through the rest. Outpost no longer secure. County records altered again. If locker A is found, assume they are watching the site. Do not trust sale notices. And farther down, on a page dog-eared from repeated handling, the truth will not survive in the file room. It has to survive in pieces. Ethan read that line twice. The cold in the building seemed sharper now. He opened the plastic-sealed paper logbook. More names. More dates. A reference to reservoir levels, maintenance windows, access keys, and something abbreviated H9 repeated 3 times beside the old pump house notation. He slid the photographs free. The first showed dead fish floating in a black slick near a shoreline that had once been green. The second showed a tanker truck at night, parked near a restricted service road. The third was grainy, taken from a distance, but the face stepping out of the passenger side of a sedan near the reservoir embankment was clear enough. A man in a dark overcoat, older now maybe, but recognizable. Ethan knew that face from county redevelopment brochures and city council news clips. Gideon Vale, regional developer, donor, public visionary, if you believe the headlines. His company had spent the last 5 years buying distressed public use land, repackaging it, and making a great deal of money off revitalization. Shadow stood close enough now that Ethan could feel the dog's heat against his side. Ethan looked down at the evidence tag. Case number 1147. Our description line torn away. Officer initials missing. But the county seal at the bottom was authentic. He sat back slowly on his heels. A hidden locker under a decommissioned kennel floor. Notes warning of a sale. Pictures linking a powerful buyer to an old restricted site. And a message written by someone who clearly believed official records could not be trusted to keep the truth alive. This was no forgotten stash. This was a fail-safe. Ethan closed the box and stood. His breath had gone shallow without him noticing. He forced it steady again, the way he had learned years ago. One controlled inhale, one measured release. Emotion could come later. First came order. He photographed everything in place. Then he repacked the contents exactly as found and locked the steel box into his vehicle evidence case. Shadow remained by the open floor panel, but he wasn't looking at the box anymore. He was looking out the side doorway of the kennel building toward the reservoir, toward the pump house. Ethan followed the line of his gaze. "You think this is the start," he said. Shadow's ears shifted forward. Not the whole thing. The dog took one step toward the door. Ethan stared after him, jaw set. He should have called it in right then. Protocol said notify Captain Hayes, secure the scene, request forensic support, log possible corruption concerns through internal command, and not touch another inch of the site until authorized. Protocol also assumed the people manipulating the site were outside the room, not possibly threaded through the paperwork that governed it. He didn't like that thought. He liked liking it even less. His phone had one bar at the outpost gate and none inside the kennel, so he stepped outside into the wind and called Maria from the rise near the office shed. She answered on the second ring. "Hayes." "Cole?" A brief pause. "You're early." "I found something." Her silence sharpened. "What kind of something?" Hidden evidence cache under the kennel floor, not old training records. Possible off-book investigative material. References to county alteration, land sale urgency, and Gideon Vale. That bought him 2 full seconds of quiet. When Maria spoke again, her voice had changed from administrative patience to command-level focus. "Are you certain about what you're looking at?" "I'm certain enough not to discuss it over bad reception." "Is the site secure?" "For now." "For now isn't secure." No sign of active presence. But cameras are dead. One gate line's been handled recently, and Shadow's alerting on the old pump house. Pump house? Wasn't in the sale packet. That silence again. Ethan could picture her standing at her desk, one hand on the edge, eyes narrowed the way they always did when someone somewhere had made her paperwork lie to her. "Do not enter the pump house yet," she said. "Do you hear me?" "Yes." "Hold the site. Log everything. Share nothing outside direct chain." "I'm sending Lucas with equipment, and I want the evidence transferred under custody the minute he gets there. Then I'll pull Lena in on analysis." Ethan looked out at the reservoir. The pump house stood where Shadow had fixed his attention, unchanged and ugly under the winter sky. Maria? What? If this ties to the sale, someone may move faster once they know the site is active. Then we move faster lawfully, she said. Not recklessly. I know exactly what you're tempted to do, Ethan. His jaw tightened. Her tone softened only slightly. Don't confuse urgency with permission to repeat history. The words landed harder than he expected. He almost responded. Almost told her that Port Mason had gone bad because waiting had cost them their narrow window. Almost told her that hesitation had not saved anyone that night. Almost said he lived with that every day already and did not need it wrapped in command voice and handed back to him. Instead, he said, "Understood. Lucas is 28 minutes out. Lena will meet you off-site if needed. And Ethan?" "Yeah? Trust the dog, but don't outrun your evidence." The line clicked dead. Ethan stood a moment longer with the phone in his hand. Wind moved over the reservoir in a long, rough sheet. Somewhere behind him, Shadow shifted against the gravel. "Don't outrun your evidence." It was the sort of thing Maria said because she knew exactly how he was built. He was good at patience until his instincts locked on. Then patience became friction. Then friction became action. He turned. Shadow was watching him. The shepherd's face was unreadable, but something about that steady gaze loosened the pressure in Ethan's chest by half an inch. "Yeah," Ethan muttered. "I know." He spent the next 20 minutes doing what needed doing. He secured the kennel door, photographed the dead cameras, checked the classroom structure, and logged the broken shed latch. He found fresh scrape marks near the power junction box behind the office building, recent enough that the metal still showed silver under the paint. He traced a partial boot impression in frozen mud beside the rear service path leading toward the reservoir road. Not enough for an ID, enough to confirm movement. Lucas arrived in a county pickup exactly 27 minutes later, because Lucas Reed was many things: young, energetic, occasionally too pleased with his own jokes. But late to a scene was rarely one of them. He climbed out wearing a brown tactical jacket half zipped against the cold, dark curls shoved flat by a knit cap, expression already alert. "Please tell me you dragged me away from lunch for something illegal and not because this place creeped you out." Ethan handed him a camera. "It's both." Lucas's grin vanished the moment he saw Ethan wasn't joking. They made the evidence transfer clean. Ethan briefed him fast, showed him the cache contents without over-explaining, and watched the rookie's face change from curiosity to disbelief to something tighter and more serious. "That's Vale," Lucas said, holding the photograph carefully by the edges. "Yeah." "And this was hidden under the kennel floor?" "Yeah." Lucas let out a low breath. "Okay, so officially I hate today. Get in line." Together they walked the outpost perimeter. Lucas logged recent tampering near the power box and found a cut in the fence line, partly concealed by dead brush behind the storage shed. Not large, just enough for a person to pass through sideways if they knew where to push. Shadow ranged ahead, then doubled back repeatedly toward the same shoreline vector. Twice Ethan redirected him to continue the broader sweep. Twice the dog complied. The third time Shadow stopped near the edge of the drill yard, turned his whole body toward the reservoir, and stood there with such focused certainty that Lucas noticed it too. "He's got a thing about that pump house," Lucas said. "He had it before I opened the locker." Lucas followed the dog's line of sight. "You thinking secondary stash?" "I'm thinking this place was built around more than training." Lucas glanced at him. "And Maria told you not to go in." Ethan said nothing. Lucas snorted softly. "Right, that kind of silence." They finished by late afternoon. Light was already thinning when Ethan loaded the last of the documented materials into Lucas's truck for official transport. The younger deputy lingered by the tailgate. "I can stay," he said, "if you want a second set of eyes." Ethan looked toward the reservoir road. Wind had deepened. The pump house sat in a band of failing light, darker now than the water behind it. "Go," Ethan said. "Get this into custody. Make sure it goes through Maria directly. No clerk desk, no general intake, no delays." Lucas studied him for half a second too long. "And you?" "I'll hold the site." That sentence usually means you're about to do the thing you were told not to do. Drive. Lucas opened his mouth, closed it again, then pointed at Shadow. "I'm on the dog side if this gets stupid." Shadow thumped his tail once against Ethan's leg. "See?" Lucas said. "He gets it." Then he left. Silence rolled back in behind the truck almost immediately. Not true silence, never that. The outpost had its own noises. Loose tin shifting on the storage shed roof, wire ticking against a fence post, frozen branches clicking together in the trees uphill, the low mechanical pulse from somewhere deep under the embankment where older infrastructure still breathed its old metallic breath. Ethan stood in the middle of the abandoned yard as evening drew down around him. He should wait for Lena's analysis. He should hold exactly where he was. He should. Shadow looked at the pump house. Ethan stared at it too. Something about the hidden notes kept needling him. If Locker A is found, assume they are watching the site. Not watched in the past tense. Watched. The fast-tracked sale, the missing cameras, the handled fence, the fresh marks at the power box. Someone had not just wanted the place abandoned. Someone had wanted it blind. He took out his radio, checked signal, then clipped a flashlight to his jacket and holstered his sidearm more securely under the coat. Shadow rose before Ethan spoke, already keyed to the shift in intent. "This is a look," Ethan said. "Nothing else." Shadow came to heel. By the time they started down the shoreline path, the sky had gone from gray to iron blue. The reservoir breathed cold at them in long, damp currents. Reeds brushed Ethan's pant legs. Old ice cracked somewhere near the shallows with a sound like distant glass. The pump house grew larger as they approached, and with size came detail. Fresh scoring near the lock plate. One window recently wiped from the outside, leaving a cleaner arc through the dirt. Boot tracks half preserved in mud where the overhang had protected them from frost. Ethan crouched. Recent. Within a day, maybe less. Shadow gave a low, controlled rumble in his chest. "Easy." Ethan trained his flashlight beam along the wall. The old county stencil near the service hatch had been painted over, but not well enough. Under the newer gray coat, red letters showed through in faint broken shapes. H9. Access. His eyes narrowed. He remembered the repeated notation from the field logbook. Not a random pump house, then. A designated node, maybe maintenance, maybe conduit, maybe something else. He moved to the door and listened. Nothing. Not quite nothing. A faint interior sound. Metallic, intermittent. Could have been pipe contraction in the cold, could have been something touching metal from the inside. Shadow's body tightened. The dog's nose lifted toward the lower seam of the door, then moved to the window, then back again. His breathing had shortened almost imperceptibly, the way it always did when scent and uncertainty overlapped. Ethan stepped to the side of the frame and tested the handle. Locked, but not fully seated, as if someone had closed it fast and not checked the catch. He looked once over his shoulder at the dark outpost behind them, then back at the door. "Quick look," he said quietly. Shadow's ears flicked. Ethan eased the handle down and pushed. The door opened 3 inches with a long, reluctant groan. Cold, wet air drifted out, carrying rust, algae, old fuel, and another scent beneath it, faint but unmistakable to a man who had spent enough time in machinery spaces and evidence rooms. Smoke, recent smoke, not active fire, the memory of one. His pulse slowed instead of quickening. That always happened when the edges sharpened. He widened the opening and swept his light inside. Concrete floor wet in patches. Old control panels along the left wall, a rusted ladder descending through a floor hatch at center, pipe housing to the rear. And on the far side, near a workbench bolted to the wall, fresh ash, small, disturbed, as if paper had been burned there in a hurry. Shadow entered first on command, low and precise, his paws making almost no sound on the damp concrete. Ethan followed, closing the door enough to cut the worst of the wind. The beam of his flashlight moved over the walls. Someone had been inside recently. No question now. A boot print in drying grit, a glove smear on the workbench, a spent match near the ash pile. Shadow ignored all of it. He moved past the burned debris, past the ladder hatch, and stopped at the back wall where 2 thick old conduits disappeared into concrete. There, he began to scent upward, then down, then along the seam where wall met floor. Ethan came beside him. "What do you have?" Shadow pressed his nose against one rusted valve housing, then shifted left 2 feet and sat. Indication. Deliberate. Ethan lowered his light. Bolted behind the valve assembly was a steel service panel the size of a briefcase. Unlike the rest of the room, it had been cleaned recently. Not polished, just touched. Used. He reached for the screws, then stopped. From outside came the distant grind of an engine. He froze. Shadow's head snapped toward the door, every muscle going tight. The engine cut off. No headlights showed through the dirty window, but Ethan no longer needed them. Someone had come down the service road without lights. Someone who knew the path. Someone who knew enough to kill the engine before the final approach. Ethan stepped backward, hand near his weapon, flashlight beam deaded against his leg. Shadow rose in silence. Boots outside. One set, maybe two, the wind made it hard to tell. A pause on the gravel, then the slow scrape of someone testing the pump house door from the outside. The handle moved once, slowly. Not the random knock of wind, not the loose rattle of bad hardware. A hand. Ethan shifted left of the doorframe, sidearm drawn but low, the muzzle angled toward the damp floor. He could hear his own breathing, and beneath it, the smaller sounds that mattered more, water ticking through old pipes, the faint hum of stressed metal somewhere below the hatch, Shadow's controlled exhale as the dog set his weight over his front paws. Another careful test of the handle, then nothing. The silence outside deepened until it felt deliberate. Ethan raised 2 fingers toward Shadow, then flattened his hand in a silent stay. The German shepherd froze, gaze fixed on the door, body wound tight but disciplined. Ethan's heart had settled into that old operational rhythm he no longer trusted and never fully lost. The world narrowed. Door, window, back wall, hatch, valve assembly, one point of entry, but not necessarily one person. He ran the possibilities the way training and years had carved into him. If the person outside was alone, he might be checking whether the site was empty. If he had a partner, one could already be moving around the structure toward the window. If he knew the panel was here, he was not curious. He was committed. And if he was committed, he was dangerous in exactly the way Ethan hated most, cold, practical, and already late in the sequence. The doorknob stopped moving. A beat later, footsteps slid off to the side of the building. Shadow's ears twitched right, tracking. Window. Ethan pivoted just enough to cover the grime-coated glass. For 1 second, he saw nothing but his own dim reflection and the ghost of the dog behind him. Then a shape crossed the window, dark coat, broad shoulders, quick and low. Not County, not some lost hiker, not a kid looking for a place to drink. The shape vanished. A hard metallic thud struck the outer lock plate. Once, then again. Whoever was outside had stopped pretending. The third strike came heavy enough to shake rust from the doorframe. Ethan moved in 3 fast steps, braced one boot against the base, and called out in a voice that filled the little pump house like a command in a metal corridor. "County police, step back from the door." The blows stopped. The silence afterward felt uglier. Then a voice came through the wood, male, middle-aged, flat with effort but not panic. "You shouldn't be in there." Ethan's eyes narrowed. No fear, no surprise, just irritation. "Open with your hands visible." A short laugh came back, humorless and raw around the edges. "That's not how tonight goes." Shadow gave one low growl, a warning pulled so deep from his chest it seemed to vibrate the damp air itself. The man outside heard it. "Dog too, huh?" he said. "That's inconvenient." Something in the phrasing chilled Ethan more than the winter air ever had. Not alarm, calculation. He wasn't improvising. He was adjusting. Ethan took 1 step back from the door and risked a quick glance at the service panel behind the valve housing. If there was another cache here, the man outside wanted it gone more than he wanted to walk away clean. That meant the cache mattered. It also meant the clock had just shortened. He thumbed the radio at his shoulder and got only static. The concrete shell and the reservoir embankment were killing half the signal. "Lucas," he said anyway, low and clipped. "Maria, active presence at pump house. Possible suspect on site." Static. Nothing. Outside, boots scuffed over gravel again, moving away from the entrance. Shadow's head tracked left, the back wall. The dog looked at Ethan once, then toward the hatch in the floor, then back again. Ethan understood immediately. Another way out. He cut his light and moved toward the floor hatch, lowering himself beside it. The old iron ring was slick with cold moisture. He lifted carefully. The hatch came open with a whisper of rust. Below, a vertical ladder disappeared into darkness. He aimed the flashlight beam down just long enough to catch a narrow service tunnel, maybe 4 feet wide, concrete-lined, with old utility piping running shoulder height along one side, and fresh, wet footprints on the lower landing. Someone had used it recently. That made two things true at once. The man outside knew about the access route, and he might not be the only one who had. Ethan looked up sharply toward the wall panel Shadow had indicated, then toward the door, then back to Shadow. The shepherd's eyes never left him. There was no confusion in them, no frantic energy, just the same silent demand the dog had carried since the moment they arrived. This matters. Move. Ethan holstered his weapon, crouched at the service panel, and attacked the screws with his field tool. 1, 2, 3. His gloves slipped once on the fourth, and his jaw tightened. Rust resisted. He forced himself not to rush the wrong way. The whole trick of pressure was refusing to let it own your hands. Outside, something scraped against concrete. The window darkened briefly. A sharp chemical smell followed. Fuel. Ethan's head snapped toward the glass. The bastard had brought accelerant. He got the last screw free and ripped the panel off. Behind it was not a utility cavity, but a narrow compartment sealed with waxed fabric and thick tape. A rectangular bundle sat inside, wrapped in oilskin, along with a metal tube and a smaller pouch no larger than a folded shirt. There it was. The archive. Of course, the retired detective had buried it behind function instead of under floorboards. Hide truth where only a worker, a patient one, or a dog could find the pattern. Shadow's ears shot back. A soft liquid splash hit the outer wall, then another, fuel running down concrete. Ethan grabbed the bundle, shoved the smaller pouch into his jacket, and slung the metal tube under one arm. At the same instant, fire flared orange across the lower edge of the grime-coated window. Not a blast. Worse, a crawling, hungry sheet of flame. It swallowed the residue on the wall, licked up the old paint, and sent sudden heat punching through the cold room. Smoke rolled in dirty black waves around the frame. "Move!" Shadow needed no second order. The dog spun toward the floor hatch and dropped down the ladder so fast he barely made a sound. Ethan followed, one hand gripping the archive, boots hitting the rungs hard enough to jolt his knees. Above him, the fire caught more fuel near the door and surged with a low animal roar. By the time Ethan reached the bottom, smoke was already pushing through the hatch, opening in twisting black strands. The tunnel smelled of wet concrete, rust, algae, and old electricity. Also, river slick cold. Water. He shone the flashlight ahead. The service passage ran maybe 30 yards before angling upward toward another access point, but at the far end he could already see movement where there should have been none, thin water slipping over the floor in clear ribbons, reflecting his light in trembling lines. Reservoir pressure, maybe routine seepage, maybe something the fire had forced loose above, maybe the beginning of the flood control release Maria had warned about. The tunnel had just become a trap with a fuse. Shadow waited 10 feet ahead, body turned halfway back to Ethan, eyes bright in the beam. "Go!" They moved. The ceiling was too low for Ethan to run upright. He had to hunch forward, archive tight against his chest, flashlight cutting a narrow white path through old utility shadows. Water soaked his boots almost immediately, numbing his feet through the leather. Behind them, the fire above found air and spread. The tunnel breathed smoke in slow, ugly pulses. Every inhale came harder than the one before. Halfway down, Ethan's radio crackled suddenly, voice breaking through static and concrete in shattered pieces. Then, respond. "Pump house service tunnel," he barked back. "Fire! Possible arson. I've got the archive." The reply was torn apart by interference, but he caught enough. "Release warning. Move now." Then another sound rolled through the passage. Not man-made exactly, not even loud at first, just deep. A long subterranean shudder that Ethan felt through the soles of his boots before he heard it with his ears. The kind of sound big structures make when pressure changes somewhere upstream and the whole system remembers it was built to move water, not mercy. His throat tightened. The flood control discharge had started. The thin ribbons on the floor became a sheet. Shadows sped up. They reached the far ladder just as a new rush of water slammed around Ethan's calves from behind, almost twisting him sideways. He caught the rail with one hand and rammed the flashlight between his teeth long enough to heave the archive upward onto the landing. "Up!" Shadow sprang to the upper rungs, claws ringing against metal, then vanished through the square of dark above. Ethan followed, shoulder burning, lungs tightening on smoke. When he pushed through the top hatch, freezing night air hit him like a blow. They had emerged outside the pump house near the embankment spill access, a place screened from the main shore by brush and concrete braces. Red warning lights were strobing weakly along the flood control line now, turning the snowless mud into alternating bands of blood color and black. And 10 yards away, half turned toward them, stood the man who had tried to burn them alive. He was larger up close than the shape in the window had suggested, thick through the chest, broad-necked, winter coat open over dark work clothes. His face was hard to read in the warning flashes, square jaw, weather-cut skin, eyes that looked like they had spent a lifetime choosing utility over conscience. Not young, not old. Built like someone who had done physical work long enough to know exactly how much force mattered and when. One hand held a revolver low against his thigh. The other was empty. He had expected the fire to finish the job. For the first time, Ethan saw surprise in him. Then it vanished. Shadow launched with a bark that tore across the embankment like a shot. The fixer jerked the revolver up in reflex, but Ethan was already moving. He drove forward off the hatch landing and hit the man below the gun arm with all the force he had left. They slammed into the wet concrete wall together. The shot went wild, blowing sparks from a steel railing above Ethan's shoulder. Pain burst down Ethan's left side where bone met metal. He ignored it. The revolver hand came back toward him. Ethan trapped the wrist with both hands and drove his forehead into the man's cheekbone. The fixer grunted, staggered, then twisted with brutal strength that told Ethan this was not some office creature sent to do ugly work from a safe distance. This man knew how to hurt and keep moving. Shadow hit him low from the side, not a full bite. There wasn't room, but enough impact to destroy his footing for half a second. Half a second was everything. Ethan ripped the revolver free and flung it into the darkness beside the spill channel. The fixer reacted with immediate economy. No curses, no threats. He pivoted and drove an elbow straight into Ethan's ribs, then another into his shoulder, then shoved for separation. They were no longer fighting for dominance. They were fighting for access, for the archive lying on the concrete 3 feet away. The man lunged for it. Ethan caught the back of his coat, dragged him sideways, and both of them went down hard into freezing runoff, sluicing over the platform. The impact knocked air out of Ethan's chest. For one sickening second, Port Mason flashed through him, not as a clean memory, but as sensation. Cold metal, narrowing space, someone shouting his name from too far away, the knowledge that one bad second had become permanent. His hands weakened, his focus blurred. The fixer felt it and surged on top of him. That was the old trap, the freeze that came not from fear, but from memory, wearing the face of the present. You hesitate, you lose someone else. Shadow's bark cracked the moment in two. The dog was not at the edge of the memory. He was here, now, teeth bared, body between Ethan and the next strike, eyes burning with total commitment. Ethan sucked air so hard it hurt. Then he came back all at once. He trapped the attacker's sleeve, rolled with the momentum instead of against it, and used the slick concrete under them to redirect the man straight into the spill rail. The fixer's head clipped steel, not enough to end it, enough to slow him. Ethan rose on one knee. Stay down. The man spat water and blood, smiled once without humor, and reached inside his coat. Ethan saw the knife too late to intercept clean. The blade flashed low. Shadow hit his forearm before the strike completed. This time it was a full working bite, precise, committed, devastating. The fixer shouted, the first true loss of control Ethan had heard from him, and slammed his arm against the concrete trying to break the grip. Shadow held with trained ferocity, all force and certainty. Ethan stepped in, stripped the knife free, drove the man face first to the wall, and pinned him there with his forearm across the back of the neck. "You are done," Ethan said, each word cut from breath and cold. From somewhere beyond the brush line came the wash of headlights and the shout of approaching voices. Lucas first, by the sound of it, fast and too loud, as always when he was 2 seconds from being useful. Then Maria, sharper, commanding, unmistakable. Shadow released on Ethan's order and back 2 steps, chest heaving, teeth still bared. Lucas came around the concrete brace with weapon drawn, nearly sliding in the runoff before he caught himself. "I got him!" Maria was right behind him, coat open, eyes taking in the scene in one sweep. Burning pump house, rising reservoir pressure, restrained suspect, Ethan soaked to the thighs, Shadow bristling over the archive bundle. "Secure the man," she snapped. Lucas moved in with cuffs. The fixer did not resist now. Whatever calculation had driven him here had finally run out of options. Maria reached Ethan and gripped his shoulder once, hard, as if confirming he was real. "You disobeyed a direct order." Ethan coughed smoke into the freezing air. "Yeah." She looked at the flames punching from the pump house window, then at the oilskin bundle by Shadow's paws. "You'd better tell me it was worth it." Ethan followed her gaze. It was. The old structure gave a groan from deep inside itself, part fire, part pressure, part failing age. Water thundered louder through the release line. A section of roof folded inward with a shower of sparks. "Everybody back!" Maria shouted. They retreated uphill along the embankment road as the pump house lost its shape behind them. Shadow stayed so close to Ethan's leg their bodies touched every third stride. Lucas dragged the fixer forward in sharp jerks. The man stumbled once, looked back at the burning structure, and for the first time his face showed something beyond calculation. Not remorse, loss. He had failed the task that mattered. That mattered too. By the time county fire units reached the lower access road, there was almost nothing left of the pump house worth saving except what Ethan had carried out of it. And what Shadow had refused to let die. The night did not end so much as become procedure. Statements, photographs, medical checks Ethan insisted he did not need until Maria told the EMT to look at him anyway. Shadow getting rinsed clean of soot and reservoir filth while standing with the long-suffering dignity of a soldier who hated baths but tolerated them for the sake of mission completion. The fixer was transported under guard. The knife, the accelerant canisters found near the shoreline brush, the cut fence behind the outpost, the sabotaged power box, the revolver dragged from the spill runoff by searchlights just after midnight. It all began to form the shape Ethan had sensed from the first moment at the site. Not random pressure, not corporate impatience, a controlled erasure. The archive was opened just before dawn in a secured county room under Maria's authority, with Ethan, Lucas, Lena, and Shadow present. Lena Moore arrived with her hair still damp from a rush shower, dark coat over a charcoal sweater, reading glasses already in hand, and irritation in every line of her face. She looked first at Ethan's bruised jaw, then at the soot ground into his sleeves, then at Maria. "I assume he ignored instructions." Maria's expression didn't change. "You can note that in your private emotional journal later." Lena set her case on the table and looked down at Shadow, who sat beside Ethan's chair with singed fur along one shoulder and the calm composure of a dog who knew he had done exactly what was required. Her expression softened by a degree. "You," she said quietly to him, "are the only one in this room who appears to have behaved flawlessly." Lucas snorted. Ethan almost smiled. Then Lena cut the oilskin wrap. Inside lay the retired detective's real insurance policy. Not dramatic, not cinematic, better. Original maintenance maps linking the old pump house and outpost kennels to a buried discharge bypass line that had never been fully reported in county infrastructure revisions. Water sampling logs, photographs with dates, a cassette recorder sealed in plastic, ledger copies connecting shell contractors to unauthorized waste movement near the reservoir decades earlier. Handwritten interview notes from a witness who later died in what had been ruled an accident. And most important of all, a signed internal memorandum proving county land records had been altered years later to obscure the true environmental liability zone surrounding the reservoir. Every piece alone was suggestive. Together, they were devastating. Lena worked through the material with that brilliant, contained intensity Ethan had always admired in her. She never performed intelligence. She just applied it relentlessly until confusion had nowhere left to hide. After an hour, she removed her glasses, sat back, and spoke into the room's silence. "This is enough." Maria folded her arms. "Enough for what?" "For a formal corruption inquiry, reopening the death connected to the contamination event, freezing the land transfer, and dragging every document related to Gideon Vale's redevelopment interests into daylight." Lucas let out a low whistle. "That's a pretty good morning." Lena turned one page back and tapped a notation with one finger. The retired detective knew the first locker might be found. He deliberately split the truth so that destroying one cache wouldn't kill the case. He trusted pattern, time, and eventually someone persistent enough to follow both. Her eyes lifted to Shadow. And perhaps a better nose than his own. Ethan looked at the dog. Shadow simply sat, ears relaxed now, gaze moving from voice to voice, as though he understood the significance not of the paperwork, but of the room itself. The shift from danger into recognition, from isolated instinct into shared certainty. For the first time in months, maybe longer, Ethan felt something inside him settle rather than strain. Not relief exactly, closer to alignment, as if a gear that had been grinding wrong for a long time had finally found its teeth again. The next days were a storm of official motion. Search warrants were signed, financial records were pulled, emergency injunctions stopped the sale of the outpost and the surrounding reservoir adjacent parcels tied to Vale's development plan. Environmental investigators reopened old sampling zones that had been closed on paper but never truly resolved. State and county authorities, embarrassed by what the archive suggested, suddenly found tremendous energy for transparency. Gideon Vale did not come to the outpost. He did what powerful men did when sunlight arrived unexpectedly. He issued statements through attorneys, denied knowledge, condemned isolated bad actors, and insisted his company had always acted within the law. But the shape of his control had already cracked. The fixer's arrest mattered. The recovered memorandum mattered more. And the retired detective's patient refusal to trust a single system with the whole truth mattered most of all. Ethan spent those days in motion, briefings, supplemental statements, quiet returns to the outpost with Maria and Lena to mark evidence locations, one long afternoon with Lucas tracing old reservoir maintenance routes that now looked less like public utility history and more like an anatomy chart of buried intent. Through all of it, Shadow stayed close. Not clingy, never that, just present. Sometimes Ethan would look down and find the shepherd already watching him with the old, steady expression that always seemed to ask the same thing without words. Are you in this moment or somewhere else? It annoyed Ethan how often the answer was not here. At night, when the work paused and the adrenaline drained off, Port Mason came back harder. The failed operation had lived in him like shrapnel ever since it happened, small enough that no one could see it from the outside, sharp enough to cut every time he moved wrong. A warehouse entry, bad intel, tight corridors, a civilian hidden where there should have been none. Ethan choosing one direction a second too early and the whole room turning into consequence. He had told himself ever since that hesitation and trust were both luxuries. That structure mattered more than instinct. That instinct mattered more than mercy. That any formula might save him from ever making the wrong call again. But the truth was uglier. There was no formula, only character under pressure, only whether a person still chose to protect what mattered when certainty was impossible. On the third evening after the pump house fire, Ethan stood alone in the outpost yard while sunset bled dim red under the clouds and caught on the chain-link fence in strips of light. The place no longer looked dead. Bruised, yes. Weathered, scarred, but not dead. County tape marked the kennel floor. Investigators had set temporary lights along the office wall. Fresh tire tracks crossed the access road. The pump house itself was now a blackened shell down by the reservoir, cordoned off and under guard. Shadow sat beside him, facing the water. "You know what I hate?" Ethan said quietly. The dog flicked one ear. That it took a dog and a dead detective to get me moving like I still had a pulse. Shadow looked up at him. Ethan huffed a breath that almost became a laugh and died halfway there. "Yeah, not your problem." He rested a hand on the shepherd's neck. Warm fur, living weight, no judgment, just contact. Behind him, Boots approached across the gravel. Maria. He knew her footfall before she spoke, steady, measured, the rhythm of a person who never hurried to prove urgency because urgency had learned to wait for her. "You disappeared after briefing," she said. "I was here." "That qualifies as disappearing with you." He glanced back. She stood with her coat buttoned high against the cold, dark hair pulled back, posture calm and impossibly composed for a woman carrying half the county's public headache on her shoulders. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough that 3 people who ignored old warning signs are suddenly pretending they were visionaries all along. That sounds healthy." "It's government." She stepped beside him and looked toward the reservoir. For a while neither of them spoke. Finally Maria said, "The retired detective's name was Colin Voss." Ethan turned slightly. "Lena confirmed it from old personnel signatures. He kept the site active on paper longer than he should have been able to, probably bought himself time through administrative confusion." Ethan absorbed that. The hidden lines, the split caches, the decision to trust the future more than the present. Smart man. Paranoid man. Same neighborhood. That earned him the smallest trace of a smile. Then Maria's expression sobered again. "The case from Port Mason came up today." He felt his shoulders tighten. "Not in discipline review," she said, before he could answer. "In context." He said nothing. Maria watched the black ruin of the pump house. "You know what Lena told the investigators?" "That I'm difficult?" "She said your weakness is that when you care, you compress timelines in your own head. You can see the end of a chain faster than most people, but once you see it, you start living in the last link instead of the next one." Ethan looked down at the frozen ground between his boots. "That sounds like Lena. It also sounds true." He let that sit. Maria continued, voice even. "But she also said there are officers who freeze because uncertainty scares them. And there are officers who force decisions because uncertainty angers them. You're neither, Ethan. You move because you can't bear handing danger 1 extra minute to hurt someone." The wind moved over the yard in a long, cold sweep. "I got someone hurt," he said quietly. Maria did not offer him an easy denial. She never had. That was one of the reasons he trusted her. "Yes," she said. The word hit clean. "And if you spend the rest of your life building yourself around one failure," she continued, "then the failure gets 2 lives instead of 1. He closed his eyes for a second. Shadow leaned lightly against his leg. Maria glanced at the dog. "The reason that animal works so well with you isn't because he's obedient. It's because he reads your center. If you stay split in half, sooner or later he pays for it too." Ethan opened his eyes. Below them the reservoir reflected the last dirty band of light like a blade. "I nearly lost him in that tunnel." "But you didn't?" "I still took him in there." Maria's jaw shifted once. "And he brought you out with the archive." The truth of that settled between them, not as absolution, as fact. She turned to leave, then stopped. "The county asked what should happen to the outpost once the legal freeze becomes permanent." Ethan looked at her. "I told them I'd answer after I heard from the officer who seems unable to leave it." With that she walked back toward the temporary lights, leaving him with the wind, the darkening yard, and Shadow's steady breathing. The dog looked up at him. Ethan stared out over the outpost again. The kennels, the broken drills, the old office, the training ground gone to weed and weather. He imagined it repaired, not polished, not reborn into something false, just made useful again. Honest work replacing neglect, dogs moving through the runs, people arriving hollowed out by service or grief and discovering structure before they discovered language. Purpose before healing. Maybe that was the only order the human mind ever truly believed. He looked down at Shadow. "You picked the place," he said. Shadow blinked once. "Which means, if this turns into a complete disaster, it's partly on you." The shepherd thumped his tail against the frozen dirt, and for the first time since arriving, Ethan laughed for real. The legal case widened over the next month like ice breaking across a river. It did not happen dramatically. Truth almost never did. It happened by accumulation, a bank transfer that linked one shell contractor to another, a decades-old maintenance discrepancy that no longer looked like clerical error once mapped against the contamination route, a retired county staffer suddenly willing to talk when shown the signed memorandum, a second witness whose memory had been dismissed years earlier and now aligned with the recovered logs almost perfectly. Bit by bit, the lie lost places to hide. The outpost remained under county preservation hold. Investigators came and went. Environmental crews tested soil and runoff along the reservoir perimeter. The blackened pump house was dismantled under supervision, each surviving fragment cataloged, each pipe route compared to the archive maps. Ethan stayed assigned through the inquiry's active phase, nominally for site security and canine support, though by then everyone understood his role had become something harder to define. He knew the place now. He knew Shadow's indications, Lena's pattern logic, Lucas's strengths in the field, Maria's lines of pressure and restraint. He belonged to the work. That realization came quietly, and once it came, it did not leave. One morning, 6 weeks after the fire, he found Lena on the outpost's office steps with 3 folders on her lap and a paper cup of coffee going cold in her hand. She looked up as he approached. "I've been informed your dog now has unofficial folklore status in 3 departments and 1 county clerk's office." Shadow sat beside Ethan, entirely unimpressed by his fame. "That'll ruin him," Ethan said. "It already has. Someone sent him a chew toy shaped like a hero medal." Ethan's mouth twitched. "Did he like it?" "He destroyed it immediately," which felt philosophically appropriate. She handed Ethan the top folder. Inside was a formal proposal draft. Adaptive reuse of the decommissioned outpost property. Potential functions. Working dog rehabilitation. Handler retraining. Resilience programming for officers and veterans. Structured scent work partnerships. Temporary recovery housing in the old barracks footprint pending renovation. Ethan read the page once, then again slower. "This is real?" Lena took a sip of cold coffee and made a face. "Maria doesn't traffic in decorative ideas." He looked over the yard. Lucas was at the far fence, trying and failing to straighten a warped gate with more enthusiasm than leverage. Maria stood near the drill field speaking with a county facilities supervisor. The wind lifted the edge of her coat, but not her attention. The place behind them was still rough, still scarred, still missing half of what once made it function. But it no longer felt abandoned. It felt unfinished. There was a profound difference. Lena followed his gaze. "Do not say something emotionally repressed and noble," she said. "I'm too tired for it." Ethan shut the folder. "I was going to say it needs work." "Better." He looked at Shadow, then back at the plan. Service dogs, handlers, veterans, officers who had seen too much and did not know what to do with the silence afterward. A place that would not ask them to perform recovery before beginning it. He could see it as clearly now as he had once seen every possible failure in a room. Not a fantasy, a framework, a mission. His chest tightened, but this time not with dread. "With the right people," he said slowly, "it could help." Lena gave him a long look over the rim of her cup. Officer Ethan Cole, delivering the most dramatic statement of his career in a tone normally reserved for weather reports. He almost smiled. She did then, softly, and turned her eyes back to the outpost. Colin Voss hid the truth in pieces because he assumed institutions fail when people inside them choose the safer story, she said. "The least we can do is build something here that refuses that instinct." Shadow rose and nudged Ethan's hand with his nose. Ethan rested his palm on the top of the dog's head. "Yeah," he said, "the least we can do." By early spring, the county made it official. The sale was permanently voided. The corruption investigation remained active, the homicide inquiry formally reopened, and multiple parcels once tied to Vale's redevelopment project were frozen for review. Public statements were made, committees formed, reporters called, lawyers circled. The usual noise of consequence began. But beneath all that noise, quieter work started at the outpost. Fences were repaired. The kennel building was stripped, cleaned, and reinforced. Not prettied up, rebuilt to function. The old classroom structure became office and intake space. Temporary modular cabins replaced the most damaged utility sheds. Volunteers from veteran support groups arrived with tools, truck beds full of lumber, and the practical silence of people who preferred work to speeches. Lucas threw himself into everything at once and had to be told repeatedly that speed and carpentry were not synonyms. Maria handled county approvals, budget extraction, and political friction with the grim competence of a commander who understood that systems changed only when pushed from 3 angles at once. Lena built assessment protocols, training criteria, and data structures to prove the program was not just worthy, but effective. And Ethan stayed. At first because there was too much to finish. Then, because every morning he arrived and Shadow moved through the grounds as if they were already home. Then, because leaving stopped making sense. The transformation of the place did not erase what had happened there. Ethan would not have wanted that, even if he could. The blackened concrete footings where the pump house had stood remained visible from the shoreline trail, a scar beside the reservoir. The retired detective's hidden locker under the kennel floor was marked and preserved beneath reinforced glass in the rebuilt hallway, not as decoration, but as memory. Truth lived here because someone once refused convenience. That mattered. Months later, on a clear afternoon, with the first true warmth of late spring moving through the pines, Ethan stood in the training yard, while 2 retired service dogs from another county completed their first calm exposure circuit with handlers who looked as uncertain as they were hopeful. Shadow moved between the stations with quiet authority, no longer searching for danger, but setting a standard. A veteran on the fence line watched him and said softly, almost to himself, "That dog makes it look possible." Ethan heard it. So did Shadow, perhaps only through tone. The shepherd paused, glanced back, and then continued on as if purpose were the simplest thing in the world. Maybe for him it was. For Ethan, it had taken longer. But as he looked across the yard, the rebuilt kennels, Lucas laughing at something while carrying feed buckets, Lena arguing over clipboard logistics without ever losing track of the dogs, Maria on the porch speaking with a county representative who clearly understood she was not a woman to waste time. He felt that old inner fracture begin, finally, to close. Not vanish. Scars did not vanish. They joined. They strengthened where they once split. He crouched as Shadow returned to him. The dog pressed in close, warm and solid in the afternoon light, amber eyes steady. "You were right from the first minute," Ethan said quietly. Shadow leaned into his hand. "You saw the place before I did." The wind crossed the reservoir and came up through the yard, carrying pine, damp earth, sun-warmed wood, and the distant clean smell of moving water. Not the cold, dead smell of winter now. A living one. Ethan straightened slowly and looked out over the outpost one more time. He had arrived expecting an inventory, then a mystery, then a fight. What he had found instead was a mission built from all 3, something entrusted, something protected, something earned. And beside him, as always, was the partner who had known before he did that abandoned ground was only abandoned until someone loyal enough chose not to leave.